The Heart of the Hunter by Natalie-Nicole Bates. Chapter 1. Autumn never really came to South Florida. It was more a summer that never really ended. Day after day of sunshine and humidity. It was the first day of September, and for Barret Atkins, these first days of what almost anywhere else would be autumn meant the start of alligator hunting season in South Florida. Hunting was his love since a boy. Now it was more of a diversion from the mundane day-to-day existence of his so-called life. He would give anything to have his old life back, even just to have his job back. Long hours, the lousy boss, all of it. His friends, who hated their jobs, called him lucky, and a man of leisure. They had no idea what they were talking about, or what he was going through on a daily basis. It was a year now since the accident that halted his career as a police detective, and still he was healing. Mentally, at least. His body healed itself the best it could. His thoughts drifted back to that dark night last September. He, along with several other detectives and a dozen officers, had been serving a search warrant on a piece of scum named Gunner Riley. Riley allegedly harbored a cache of illegal weapons in an old, dilapidated mobile home on the outskirts of West Palm Beach. What they found instead was a clandestine methamphetamine lab. In the ensuing mayhem, the mobile home exploded, putting Barret in the hospital for near on a month, commencing his life in hell. He drew a halt in front of Jake Conroy's airboat rentals, returning him to the present. It was 4 a.m. Jake didn't usually rent his boats, especially to people fishing or hunting on their own, but Barret had been a long-time customer, a friend of Jake's since his father had brought him here 3 decades earlier. Now, at 38, he still knew where he could get a good boat for the day. But lately, he considered buying his own boat. If this was to be his life, he might as well enjoy it the best he could. The sun had been up for several hours, an angry orange fireball that turned the swampy area into a virtual sauna. The mosquitoes buzzed furiously around his face. He slathered himself with bug repellent and sunscreen, but his skin still reddened, and his blue eyes burned. He dragged the brim of his baseball cap lower on his forehead and adjusted the neck of his white t-shirt. Sweat soaked his nape and trickled down his back. Just as he thought of turning the airboat and heading back for the day, something on the bank caught his eye. Maybe his luck changed. He raised his crossbow, then frowned. What he thought was an alligator was something entirely different. Setting the bow down, he maneuvered the boat for a better look, before pulling into the bank. Finally, seeing nothing else out of the ordinary, he drew the boat alongshore, grabbed his father's old service revolver, tucked it into his belt, and stepped out onto the land. He picked his way across the damp, spongy earth, it taking several seconds for his mind to register what he was seeing. There was a human body lying among the tangle of weeds. At first, he thought it was a hunter who collapsed, or had been accidentally shot. However, hunters wore blaze orange, not bright red and white. He heard of bodies being dumped in the swamps for the alligators and wildlife to devour. No body, no crime. But for him to actually come across a human body was surreal. Palming his revolver, he did a complete 360-degree turn, scanning the surrounding vegetation, checking to see if someone still lurked. Nothing. He dropped to his knees beside the body. Although it was bruised, bloody, and covered in mud, it was clearly a woman. Her feet were bare, but pink nail polish remained on her bare toes. Her red t-shirt and shorts were in rags. Barret went to roll the woman over, and she groaned. She was still alive. Her breathing shallow, and her pulse weak, but while she breathed and her heart beat, she had a chance. There was no obvious signs of a gunshot or stab wounds, but there was no way of telling what lurked beneath all the blood and mud. However, he was certain of one thing. He had to get her out of the swamp before she went into cardiac arrest and did die. There was no way an ambulance would be able to get to their location. The medical helicopter would have nowhere to land. If she were moved, he risked paralyzing her if she suffered a spinal cord injury. If he went back for help, she'd surely be dead when he returned. He had no choice. He had to get her into the boat and back to Jake Conroy's airboat tours. Slipping his gun into its holster, he reached for the woman's shoulders and knees and lifted her into his arms. She was tiny and light, and he didn't have much trouble getting to his feet. As she began to moan, his heart thumped harder in his chest. I'm sorry. he kept repeating as he made his way back to the airboat. The tricky part was to get her into the boat without both of them ending up in the water. It was difficult, but he managed, and he laid her body on the bottom of the boat. He owned a first aid kit, but it was only minimally stocked with a few Band-Aids, an elastic bandage, some tape, a tube of antiseptic cream, and a bee sting kit. There were no gloves, and he hoped she wasn't HIV positive or had hepatitis. She bled from cuts and gashes all over her body, and Barret didn't know where to start trying to help her. He worked as an ambulance driver before going to college, but he really did more than use his muscle to move patients. The first aid training at the police academy wasn't much more than he had already known from the ambulance. One thing he knew he had to do was to try to lower her body temperature before she started having seizures. Reaching for the cooler of soda he had brought with him, he grabbed 2 handfuls of ice and pressed them into her skin against her chest and belly. She suddenly jumped, her torso lurching upward, and gasped for air. "It's okay," said Barret, placing a hand on her shoulder. Even though her eyelids were swollen, she managed to open them slightly and looked at him. He smiled. "You're safe now. My name is Barret. I was hunting for alligator and found you. I'm going to get you to the hospital. Don't worry. You're going to be fine." The truth was, he didn't know if she was going to be fine, but he wanted to comfort the girl any way he could. She tried to speak, but only managed a raspy whisper through her swollen purple lips. He bent closer to her face. "What's your name?" She tried to say something, but he couldn't understand. It sounded like Karen or maybe Carrie. "Is your name Carrie?" Not reacting to the name, she tried to speak again, but it was incoherent and garbled. His heart ached for the poor dying girl. "What is it, Angel?" "Kill me," she whispered. He wasn't sure he heard her correctly. You want me to kill you?" "Kill me," she repeated. Heat swamped his face, and he glanced down at the poor pitiful creature on the floor of the boat, then at his own trembling hand. He knew he could cover her mouth and nose and easily end her suffering, and then push her body into the water and let nature take its course. No one would be the wiser. A sudden bout of nausea overtook him, and he leaned over the edge of the boat and jettisoned his lunch into the water. Even if it were a mercy killing, he wouldn't be able to live with himself. Catching his breath, he fumbled for the cell phone on his belt and dialed 911. After his momentary lapse of sanity when he actually considered euthanizing her, he couldn't look at the girl. 911, what is your emergency?" "My name is Barret Atkins. I'm a detective with Palm Beach Police. I'm somewhere on the border of Broward and Palm Beach counties. Not sure exactly where. I'm in the swamps, alligator hunting, and I found a girl. A woman dumped in the swamp." "Is this a homicide, Detective Atkins?" "No, she's still alive, but she's extremely critical. There's no way an ambulance can get back here. I'll transport her back to Conroy's airboat tours on Power Lane Highway. Have the medics and the medicopter from Twin Palms Regional Hospital meet us there." "Is the medicopter necessary, Detective Atkins?" "Yes, she's critical." "She must be transferred to Twin Palms Trauma Unit. It's our only chance." Sending her to Twin Palms Regional also had the advantage that his sister, Sharon, was an emergency room physician there, and his other sister, Lizzie, a nurse. "How far are you from Conroy's?" 15 minutes, maybe quicker. Have someone call Jake Conroy and let him know what's happening. I've got to get this boat moving or this girl's going to die." Disconnecting the call, he grabbed the cooler and dumped the ice into the boat before heaving the cooler out into the bank. The cooler would serve as a marker for the detectives and forensic crew to find later. The engine wailed noisily when he started it. Before pulling away, he put several more armfuls of ice on the girl's arms and legs. She was motionless now, and he had to get her help fast. Barret made it back to Conroy's airboat tours in record time. Jake was waiting for him, as well as an ambulance and 2 police cars. "Where's the medicopter?" he called, lifting the girl into his arms. "It's on its way," Jake said, helping him off the boat. The police and ambulance crew swarmed him, and Barret was immediately concerned. "Don't hurt her. She's already hurt enough," he said, handing her over to the paramedics. He silently watched while they loaded her on a stretcher and moved away. He had softened since leaving the job. In the distance he spied his former partner, Duncan Craig, moving toward him. Immediately his stomach burned. Once upon a time he regarded Duncan as his best friend. They had attended the police academy together, rode together on a street patrol for several years, and were both simultaneously promoted to detectives. Now they were barely on speaking terms. "I'm sorry, Barret, but I'm going to need a statement from you." He wiped the sweat from his brow with a grimy bare arm and nodded. He followed Duncan to Jake's office and relayed exactly what happened from the time he started out in the airboat early that morning until he sat down for the interview. Pulling off his baseball cap, he pushed his damp, dark hair back from his face while his mind continued to replay the events of the last hour over and over again. "Barret, do you still have a change of clothes in your locker back at the precinct?" Finally he looked at Duncan. The big bastard sat there all proper in his hand-tailored suit and tie, with his badge around his neck, his blond hair short and perfectly coiffed. "What? Forensics is going to want your clothes and shoes. It's just policy. It's nothing personal." Of course, he was a suspect, he realized. They would comb over every inch of his clothing and his body, looking for some evidence that he had kidnapped and attempted to murder the girl. "Whatever you need," he countered with little expression. "I'll drive you to the precinct. I'm sure Jake can arrange to have your Jeep driven back. Just formality, Barret. No hard feelings, okay, buddy?" Barret smiled inwardly. Duncan was not his buddy. Still, it was best to go along with what he wanted. He was innocent, and no matter how much they tested him and his clothing, they would find nothing. The sooner they finished with him, the sooner he could get to Twin Palms Hospital. At the precinct, a forensic officer swabbed Barret's hands, took his clothing, a DNA sample from the inside of his mouth, scraped under his fingernails, and yanked out a sample of his hair. Barret grew weary as he sat in his old precinct across from his desk that now sat vacant. Finally, Duncan told him he was free to leave, and handed him his car keys. "Sorry, Barret. Really I am. You know how it is." He snatched his keys. "Stop apologizing, Duncan. You're only doing your job. Why don't you hang around for a while, and I'll take you to dinner?" Barret shook his head. "No thanks. I want to head over to Twin Palms and check on the girl." "A drink, then?" "I'd rather not." He rolled his car keys between his fingers and looked away. Duncan took a tentative step toward him. "Listen, Barret, we were friends for so many years. Like brothers. I miss that." Barrett's lips thinned. "Yeah, well, you should have remembered that when I was in the hospital with burns, pneumonia, and a collapsed lung, and you decided to start banging my fiancé." "Can't we go on from here?" Barret laughed shortly. "You live with my ex-fiancé. What am I supposed to do? Come over and play Monopoly with the two of you on a Saturday night?" "Molly is back living with her parents." Barret raised a brow. He was only mildly interested. He was over Molly, and realized some time ago that if she could have an affair with another man, his best friend, while he was near death in a hospital bed, then he was lucky to find out what she was really like before they married or had children. "That's too bad, Duncan," he said, his insincerity evident. "No, it's not too bad. She is a grasping and demanding. I was not ready for marriage or kids, not with her anyway, and I'm not going to let anyone force me into anything I don't want." Barret only nodded. "Well, I'll speak to you soon. If you need me to answer any more questions, you've got my numbers." He turned for the door. "Hey, don't forget that drink," Duncan called after him. Barret kept walking. Driving a few miles to Twin Palms Regional Hospital, he parked his blue Jeep in the multi-story lot. Finding the ER, he spoke to a nurse and asked for his sister. "Dr. Singleton is with a patient, but I will let her know you are waiting." "Thank you. Is the girl from the swamp here? She came in by the Metacopter?" "Yes, she is. Do you know her?" "I found her." The woman's eyes lit up. "Wow, that was you? The alligator hunter?" He gave a small chuckle. "Yes, I'm the alligator hunter. Barret Atkins. Dr. Singleton is my sister." Sliding her chair back, the nurse came to her feet. "I'll find Dr. Singleton and let her know that you're here." Sitting in the empty waiting room of the emergency department, Barret closed his eyes and tried to relax, but visions of the girl from the swamp filled his mind. He must have drifted off, for the next thing he realized, someone was tapping his face. He opened his eyes to find his sister smiling at him with her bright blue eyes. "Hi, hero." Sharon was the oldest in a family of 5 girls and him, the only boy. She was married to another emergency room physician. I must have fallen asleep. Is she okay? Come on into my office while it's quiet, and share a cup of coffee. We'll talk in private. He didn't like the sound of his sister's non-committal tone. Rising from his chair, he followed her through the double doors that separated the waiting room from the emergency room. Her office was a small, spotless side room, with a metal desk and shiny white floors and walls. All about the room were photographs of Sharon and her husband Marco, taking on all of their vacations around the world. He flopped down on the small fold-out sofa where his sister slept when they were short-handed in the emergency department. Sitting on the edge of the desk, wearing her white jacket with her photo identification attached to it, Sharon sighed. The girl is critical, Barret. I'm sorry. Is she going to make it? Unconsciously, he grit his teeth, not sure he wanted to hear her answer. It's an hour-by-hour situation. If she survives past the 72-hour mark, I'd say she has a good chance of surviving. But... Sharon looked away. But what? Sharon shook her head. I don't know what quality of life that girl will have. She took a few nasty blows to the head. A neurologist has been to see her, but I haven't read his report. Whoever did this to her was full of fury. She has broken ribs, fractured cheekbone, horrendous hematomas, and cuts all over her body. To make matters worse, she's severely sunburned and bitten up by bugs. Barret rubbed his temples and thought back to the girl's plea to kill her. Maybe it would have been more merciful if she had died out there. His sister slid from her desk. Nonsense. Every life is worth saving. He looked away. You're right. I'm sorry. Hey, sweetie. Sharon crouched beside him and took his hand. I never did ask you how you were. His gaze connected with hers. I've never been so scared in my life. It was as bad as the day of the explosion. Do you need a sleeping tablet to get you through the night? He shook his head and squeezed her hand. He had his fill of pills and medications to last a lifetime. Nah, I'll be okay. He breathed deeply. Was she raped? Sharon came to her feet. I don't believe so. I can't say for sure until the results from the rape kit come back from the lab. The gynecologist who examined her said it didn't appear that she was assaulted. There was no bruising or tearing. Barret expelled his breath. If the worst happens, and she was raped, can you make sure someone gives her a shot or something so she doesn't get pregnant? She doesn't need any trace of that monster inside her. Sharon patted his shoulder. Don't worry. It's so sweet of you to be concerned. He shrugged. Is there any news about her identity? She asked. Don't know. Duncan is in charge of the case. He'll call, I guess. There was a knock at the door, and a nurse handed Sharon 2 steaming mugs. Duncan, she spat out his name and passed Barret his coffee. That slime bag. I hope never to hear his name mentioned again. Me too. He sipped the bitter brew and wiped a hand across his mouth. An unfortunate coincidence he was assigned to this case. He paused. Sharon, do you think I could see the girl? His sister's lips pursed in consideration. She's in the intensive care unit. It's family only, but since she's technically has no family, or no identity for that matter, and I am on break, I'll take you for a short visit. After tonight, you'll have to arrange any visits with her through Lizzie. She's friendly with the staff in the ICU. Barret followed his sister into the doctor's-only elevator and got out on the 10th floor. They traipsed the long corridor and turned into the glass-fronted intensive care unit. Sharon whispered something to the woman at the reception desk, and then motioned for Barret to follow her. Hi there, Dr. Silverton. A smiling blonde nurse in a pink scrub outfit walked up to them. What can we do for you? Hi, Michelle. This is my brother Barret. He's a detective, and he's single. He's the guy who found our little swamp girl. Do you think he can take a peek at her? He's worried, and I want to ease his mind. Sure. Come on, detective. He was about to follow when Sharon grabbed his arm. I gotta get back downstairs. Michelle will answer any questions you have. She winked, and he laughed softly. His big sister, the optimistic matchmaker. Following Michelle through a large, darkened room of critically ill patients, he came up alongside her and touched his arm. You don't have to call me detective. My name is Barret. Okay, Barret. She smiled again and stopped at the foot of a bed. Try not to be shocked. This girl is very ill. Barret looked at the towering machines that flashed and beeped as they monitored the girl's every heartbeat, every breath. His eyes drifted to her face, and he moved closer to the side. Her bruises seemed worse in this light. There were IVs taped to both hands. She was now clean, but blood mattered through her dark hair, and her face was swollen and distorted. There was no way of knowing what she once looked like before the attack. "How's she doing?" Michelle adjusted the blanket on the girl's body. "Well, as can be expected." "Has she been conscious at all?" "No, and I don't expect her to be for some days. The doctors have her on a lot of medication, steroids, painkillers, antibiotics. It's best for her to sleep deeply and give her body a chance to heal itself." Nodding, he couldn't take his eyes off her battered face. "Poor little thing doesn't even have a name." "We'll hope for the best, and take good care of her." Michelle stepped back. "I'll give you a few minutes alone." Barret thanked her and moved closer to the bed with its steel side rails up and locked into place. As he watched her lying perfectly still, he thought back to the time he had spent in this very same intensive care unit. "If you can hear me, stay asleep. Make yourself better," he whispered. Unlike this girl, he remained conscious his entire time in the hospital. The doctors called it chemical pneumonia, brought on by the explosion of chemicals from the methamphetamine lab. His lung collapsed, and he endured a chest tube for nearly a week, followed by subsequent infection. The burns were worse. His face, arms, hands, and chest suffered second and third-degree burns. The aftermath was his worst nightmare realized, and he still bore the tangible remains on his body. He looked at her hands. Her fingernails were jagged and broken. She had fought to defend herself, he guessed. Good for her. Hopefully she tore the bastard up. Her feet were raw and bloody from when she must have lost her shoes and ran. Perhaps she had worn sandals or heels. He knew he was still thinking like a detective. It wasn't his job to solve this case. It was the other detectives and forensic staff to figure out what happened to this girl and find who was responsible for hurting her. Deciding it was time to go, he ran a gentle knuckle down the girl's cheek and leaned closer. "You stay with us, okay, Angel? I'm expecting you to be here when I come back tomorrow. You're safe now." He stopped at the nurses' station, where several nurses were working on various paperwork and computer duties. They were all dressed the same in pink scrub suits with their hair tied back neatly from their faces. "Thank you, ladies, for letting me see the little swamp girl." He cringed at how awful it sounded. Michelle looked up from her paperwork and smiled. "This is Dr. Silverton's brother, everyone. Detective Barret Atkins. He was the alligator hunter that found her." Barret forced a smile, wishing he could sink into the floor. He really didn't need all the attention. "Would it be possible for me to keep tabs on her?" he asked. "Perhaps I could call in later and tomorrow morning to check on her. Until her family is found, I sort of feel responsible for her." "You're so sweet," one of the younger nurses cooed. Michelle spoke up. "There will be a shift change at midnight. When you call, tell whomever answers that you know the word Gigi, and they'll talk to you. I'll leave a note, too." What a silly code word, he thought. "Thanks so much, and have a good night." Leaving the hospital, he drove back to his Ocean Park neighborhood. It was evening now, and the air was humid and sticky, and would stay that way without relief until November. Pulling his Jeep into the driveway of his two-story home, he switched off the engine, ran down the path, and let himself into the house. Once inside, he breathed a sigh of relief. It was good to be home. It was a big 4-bedroom house, but still sparsely furnished, with only the necessities of furniture. The house had been purchased with the intention of starting a family as soon as he and Molly were married. After recovering from the accident, he tried to sell it. But it was new, with dozens of others in the housing plan just like it, and not a seller's market at the time. The realtor told him to hold on to the house for a year or so, and maybe the market would improve. He never got back around to doing any kind of decorating after he moved in. The walls were still builder's flat white, but the floors were a nice cream-colored ceramic tile. The home had been bought when his life seemed secure. He'd been engaged, and Molly was the girl of his dreams. So he thought at the time. They met on a blind date set up by one of his younger sisters. He and Molly had hit it off straight away. She came from a strict Catholic upbringing and didn't believe in premarital sex. Respecting her beliefs, he never pushed her beyond the open-mouthed kisses and mild foreplay she tolerated. All of her beliefs seemed to have vanished when he had his accident, and she drifted into an affair with Duncan. It had been Duncan who sheepishly came to him while he was still recovering in the hospital to tell him that he and Molly had come together through mutual grief over his accident, and that she could not handle the possibility that his scars might be permanent. She requested Duncan to return her engagement ring to him. It was still in his dresser drawer. He had never gotten around to selling it. Gradually, he drifted into depression, and for several months vodka became his ally. Alone and embittered in an empty house, he drank while mindlessly watching hour after hour of television and shunning his family. Sharon set him up with the best plastic surgeon in the county, Dr. Matt Santos. When Dr. Santos examined his face, he told him he needed to heal for at least a year, and then they discussed a treatment plan. However, Barret couldn't wait. Vain and spoiled, he was certain if he was perfect again, Molly would come crawling back, and he would eventually forgive her. He would go back to work, and everything would return to normal, just the way it should be. A dispatcher at work had once told him about a medical clinic in Mexico where she had gotten a tummy tuck and a breast job. The doctor there was a genius, she had gushed, and he was cheap. He could fix Barret's scars, no problem. Excited by the prospects of being normal again, Barret called the clinic in Mexico. Yes, Dr. Gonzalez could use a form of dermabrasion to remove his scars. There would be a healing period, of course, but he would be on his way back to Florida the same day. No anesthetic required. When could he be in Mexico? 3 days later, he flew to Escala and met with the doctor. The clinic was small, but clean. The nurse seemed efficient. He had to pay in cash up front. During the procedure, Barret felt as if he had been burned all over again, but he was optimistic. The doctor bandaged his face and sent him on his way. He felt ill on the plane and collapsed in the terminal in the airport. When he awoke the next day in Twin Palms Regional Hospital, this time his face was horribly infected. When he saw Dr. Santos' grim expression on examining him, he knew he had made a dreadful mistake. He would now be scarred permanently. Only now did he realize it hadn't been so bad before the dermabrasion. His burns had only been in one cheek, and it might have healed if he had stayed patient. Now, after time had passed, the scars on his chest and arm had faded. If only he had waited. It was his own dark secret that one night after he left the hospital, he broke every mirror in his house before swallowing half a bottle of antidepressants mixed with a dozen sleeping tablets, washed down with vodka. He decided on pills and booze because one of his sisters had taken his guns from the house while he had been hospitalized after the botched dermabrasion. Intent on killing himself, it didn't come off as planned. A short time after swallowing the pills, he vomited violently all over his bathroom floor and passed out. Awaking 12 hours later on the tiled floor, sick to his stomach with his head throbbing, he found he was still very much alive. When his head finally cleared, he knew he had to bring himself back to life. He found the psychiatrist himself and started a course of therapy for several months. Never told anyone that he had tried to kill himself. Finally, he had got back to the business of life. After taking a long hot shower, he flopped down on his king-size bed and stared at the white popcorn ceiling, trying to make sense of the day. A ringing telephone broke through his thoughts, and he reached for it, wondering if it was his sister, calling to tell him that the little swamp girl had died. "Hello?" he said, holding his breath. "Hey, Barret, it's Duncan." Barret drew a deep breath, wanting to slam the phone down, but his curiosity got the better of him. "What is it, Duncan?" "I stopped in at the Twin Palms on my way home and checked on the girl. I heard you had been there." Unconsciously, he raised an eyebrow. "And that is a crime, why?" "I'm not saying that." "Then what are you saying?" he snapped. "That I kidnapped a woman off the street so I could take out my frustrations on her face and body, and then I rescued her so I could be a hero? Come on, Barret. I know you, Duncan. I know how you think." "Not about you, Barret. I just wanted to call and make sure you were okay. What happened today is enough to send anyone over the edge. Yes, and I'm so freaking fragile these days. Barret, you never used to be so sarcastic." Barret was enjoying this. "I'm sarcastic and bitter, Duncan. I think I've earned that right." There was a pause on the line. "I suppose you have," Duncan countered softly. This was stupid. Instead of antagonizing Duncan, he should be finding out about the girl. "So, what have you learned about the girl?" "There was nothing at the crime scene except some sneaker prints, probably from the perp. The lab is running them through the computer to identify the make. There's nothing of the girls. No handbags, shoes, nothing. Obviously, the swamp was his dumping ground. No identity on the girl, then? Nothing. We ran her fingerprints, checked through missing persons. Nothing. She might not have been a local, so we are checking nationwide missing persons. Hopefully, something will check out. This is bad, Duncan. You've got a maniac out there. I know. And a girl with no name. All the hospital can tell us is she's a white female, over 21, but under 40, slightly over 5 feet tall, 100 pounds, brown hair and brown eyes. She could be how many thousands of young women in South Florida? It's a start, and when she wakes up, she'll be able to tell you more. If she wakes up, Barret. If. Well, it's been good talking. I'd really like to have that drink sometime. We'll see, he said. Then he surprised himself by adding, "It's been good talking to you, too."